Okay, are we ready? Well, hello and welcome to the BizNews Midweek Catch-up webinar. It's me again, and I have two really exciting guests today. Today we're discussing China and its influence in Africa and South Africa. Well, while the West has been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, China has swooped in with what it's called its mask diplomacy into Africa. South Africa has benefited from that as well. President Cyril Ramaphosa has called China to ask for help early in the pandemic, and help has arrived. There were planes full of personal protective equipment that landed, and there was also a donation from Jack Ma, the Chinese billionaire owner of Alibaba, who flew in. I can actually show you guys a plane full of that, arrival of medical equipment that came on a plane of Ethiopian Air to South Africa. And I think that specific picture that the government communication information service supplied was of the donation by Jack Ma. Well, the question is, why is China doing this? Is it just altruism, or what is behind it? Is China after Africa and South Africa's strategic location, its oils, its rare earth materials, and its fish, or even its wild animals in South Africa? And would it leave African countries who are already heavily indebted to Beijing worse off afterwards? What would China want to secure for the debt it is giving to Africa? Is COVID-19 enabling a debt trap? Should South Africa be wary of Chinese debt? These are the questions we're going to ask today to my two guests, and let me introduce them. We'll start with one far away from us in Cardiff. He is Professor Sergei Radchenko. He's a professor of international relations at Cardiff University. He's also a Soviet, Russian, and Chinese foreign policy expert on the Cold War, but he spent a time in China and still wants to go back to China this summer. He'll tell us more about that. And he wrote a book, Two Suns in the Heavens, the Sino-Soviet Struggle for Supremacy, 1962 to 1967. My other guest is a very well-known ambassador of South Africa, who's been the acting Deputy Director General of the Americas and Europe of DIRCO, the Department of International Relations. And he has been the ambassador to South Africa in Spain, Japan, and Madagascar. And he's also now a senior research fellow at the Institute of African Studies in China. And I think you guys have to give me all the pronunciations of the names. I think to start, before we start off, and I want you to each just introduce yourselves a little bit more to our audience. We just want to ask Stuart, all okay there? That Stuart's our general manager. And Stuart, and I invite you please to put questions in the little box at the side. You can written questions. Oh, there's already one. And I've also been sent emailed questions. Please, we want to make this interactive and want you guys to ask the questions to these world experts on China. So can we, do you mind if we start far away? Sergei, tell a little bit more about yourself. I know you speak Chinese.
I've lived in China for a number of years. I was born in the Russian Far East, right on the border of what was then the Soviet Union in China, and grew up in the island of Sakhalin, so just north of Japan. So I was from an early age plugged into the region, in a sense, because at a different level, the region was quite cut off. The Russians were cut off, or the Soviets were cut off from Asia in many ways because of the Cold War. But in subsequent years, I worked all over Northeast Asia and indeed Central Asia. I lived in Mongolia for a number of years, then in China for maybe 4 or 5 years. And as of late, I've become a Welshman, so I've moved to Wales. But my research continues to have that focus on Asia in some ways. So the book that I'm working on now focuses on the history of the Cold War, with a particular emphasis on China, Russia, and the United States.
Well, okay, Ambassador Gert Grobler, can you introduce yourself? Well, I know you really well from the days when I covered politics in South Africa and international politics, and I ran across you in various places, from London to the East. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing now?
Thank you, Linda. It's good to see you again, and we've indeed come a long way. No, I'm in essence, I've been a diplomat my entire career in the former the South African Department of Foreign Affairs and going across into the new dispensation in South Africa after '94. I've had a 40-year career in the South African Foreign Service, including 27 years abroad in 7 countries. My last 2 posts were Japan, where I actually started focusing on the relationship between Japan and China, and of course China itself. I retired after I came back from Madagascar, and I bumped into the Chinese ambassador here in South Africa about 18 months ago. And he said to me, "Ambassador, you want to go to China?" So the result is that I am now a senior research fellow at a very, well, excellent and reputable Institute of African Studies at Zhejiang Normal University in the thriving province of Zhejiang province in China. And I must say it's been the last year, I'm now in South Africa, but the last year has been extremely stimulating and an enriching experience to get to know more about China, its people, its culture, its politics, etc.
Okay, a very diplomatic response there. So if we can start, I'm just going to show you a little picture of a recent, I'm going to put the 2 presidents there and start with President Ramaphosa, who asked for help from China. Apparently, his office told me yesterday, not for doctors, but for PPE, which was sent. So do you think, is there anything behind this mass diplomacy of China? Should we read more into it? Is it altruism? Is it China being friendly to Africa, or China's policy of expansion in Africa? Can we, Sergey, Professor Trochenko, can we ask you first?
Well, if I'm allowed to give a little historical background to this, what we see now with China's increasing engagement in Africa, of course, that has increased dramatically over the last few years, but that actually has roots in China's engagement with Africa in the 1960s. After the Chinese Revolution of 1949, the Chinese leader Mao Zedong thought about what was then called the Third World as a place where China could win countries to its own cause. China was seeking to assert leadership in the world. It was part of the Sino-Soviet alliance at that time of the socialist system, and that was part of its commitments. But a different part of its commitments was actually going out into the developing world and winning friends in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. And it was in this context that the Chinese first appeared in Africa. Mao Zedong had this idea that, well, Africa with its many problems and its poverty is actually very much like China, which I think on his part, it was a great delusion. He had no real understanding of what was actually happening in Africa. Nevertheless, he had this idea that Africa had all these people and they have the same sort of anti-imperialist impulses as China. Therefore, they could bring their forces together and that's important, under China's leadership, go out there and oppose imperialism around the world. So China's engagement with Africa goes back to the 1960s, or indeed into the 1950s. Already in the mid-1950s, for example, Zhou Enlai would meet Nasser, for example. And then in the 1960s, it intensified in countries like Tanzania, for example, and a few others. And then in the 1970s, of course, the Chinese were massively involved in the construction of railroads in Africa, etc. So there was this engagement, but from the start, the question is, what were the Chinese trying to do there? And I think the answer is it was an effort for them to make a claim to global leadership because of the alleged similarity between China and Africa, and because of their hope that African countries or decolonizing countries would follow China. They were very quickly disappointed because, for example, some of the revolutionary movements that they were supporting early on in Africa fizzled out and didn't really work out for them. But in the 1970s, Mao Zedong actually decided to change his perspective. He used to support primarily revolutionary movements, communist movements, and then he thought, well, actually, it doesn't really matter. And he started to support more reactionary regimes, for example. So that's why in the 1970s, we see China supporting, let's say in Angola, supporting UNITA, which was so bizarre from the perspective of kind of, Marxism, Leninism. Why would you support UNITA? Well, there we are. The Chinese were very pragmatic at this point. They were saying, okay, who can we support who will also in turn support us and allow us to project our leadership into Africa? So I think what we see today is an outgrowth of that, but I just wanted to give this historical background to start us off.
There is indeed a very deep and a strong relationship between China and Africa. In fact, it goes back to 130 years BC. There are lots of stories that the salt that came from China, that Cleopatra loved the salt that came from Africa, and so on. So it's been a long-standing relationship between the two countries. And as Professor Sergey said, I think the first key engagement between China and Africa was at the Bandung Conference in 1955, where at that time the ANC and the liberation movements in South Africa met with the Chinese and Prime Minister Zhou Enlai at the time, and there was always a fraternal and an understanding relationship between China and Africa that's come a long way. A lot of people would probably remember that one of the reasons that China was elected to the UN Security Council in 1971 was that the African members of the UN at that time overwhelmingly voted in favor of the UN, of China joining the UNSC at the time against Taiwan. So it's a long-standing relationship. Of course, this developed over the years, and of course, it culminated in 2000 in the creation of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, the so-called FOCAC. And from then onwards, the relationship just went from strength to strength, with the result is that China is by far Africa's biggest trading partner, totaling $205 billion US. I think the closest to that is probably the US at about 55 billion. So it's very important, and of course, also in terms of an economic partner, as Professor Sergey said, China has actually changed the infrastructure face of Africa with thousands and thousands of kilometers of roads and rails and so on. So the relationship between China and Africa is a very solid, strong relationship. And despite what happened after COVID and in the wake of COVID, there is going to be a strengthening of the relationship between China and Africa. It's already been agreed that the next meeting of FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, will take place in Senegal next year, where a lot of the issues on cooperation between China and Africa will be on the agenda. And that China has already, we can probably come back to that, China has already made a number of commitments, apart from support in the health sector, where China has actually supported probably 50 plus countries on the African continent to combat COVID, but also to play an increasingly important role on helping Africa with its economic recovery. So the picture is a positive one, it's a constructive one, and I predict that the relationship, despite a lot of the geopolitical shifts and the negative and counterproductive approach by a country like the US, that the relations between Africa and China will continue to thrive.
Technical point, make sure that I'm back. I think, Gert, I think your mic might be clicking a little bit, so just be careful when you move. I don't know if you guys are picking it up or is somebody typing. I'm not sure. I'm not typing at the moment. Just be mindful of that, so that people can hear you clearly. Well, it seems a long historical link to Africa, but the question is, is it benign? In other words, what does China want in return? Because Africa is becoming heavily indebted to China. Any of you?
Well, if I take a slightly more cautious attitude towards China's involvement in Africa in some ways. I mean, Africa has had a very difficult relationship with the West. So we have to be mindful of that background. We have to be mindful of the colonial background, and that from the perspective of many African countries, China, with its money and its infrastructural projects, etc., does not actually does seem benign compared to what preceded it. Compared, for example, to the superpower competition for Africa during the Cold War. I mean, at that time, the Soviets would get into African countries and support certain factions in civil wars, and the Americans would get in there, and the European powers tried to maintain a presence as well. So it was overall a very nasty experience. I mean, the 20th century and even the post-1945 period for much of Africa was a very nasty experience from the perspective of dealing with the so-called West, and that by the West, I also actually, in the concept of West, we can also include Russia at that time, the Soviet Union. So from that perspective, you can see China as more of so far it's been more of a benign actor, bringing in money, bringing in expertise, although we do know that there's resentment against too much money and too much expertise and corporate responsibility of Chinese companies, etc. But the question is, what do the Chinese want out of this? And that's a different question altogether that you pose, Linda. I think there are two ways to answer. Maybe I don't know if Ambassador Gorbel would agree or not, but my sense is that the number one issue for the Chinese, first and foremost, is that issue of prestige. China is trying to play a bigger role in the international stage. It is trying to show that it is one of the major, if not the major player on the international stage. And by engaging with Africa, where countries are actually welcoming China and don't really care about, let's say, some human rights abuses, or they don't care about the fact that the Communist Party is ruling China, etc. They don't care about this. They're interested in China's developmental aid. So that actually boosts China's prestige on the global stage. So that's one part of the answer, I think. The second part of the answer is what you already alluded to, and that is that Africa offers both strategic it has strategic importance for China, and also importance in terms of access to natural resources, including, for example, oil. We know those are also concerns for the Chinese. So it is both strategic interest and also prestige-related considerations.
Okay, Gert, can we have an answer from you about that as well? What do you think? You could say, isn't this a debt trap? Africa would get more indebted to the Chinese if they take loans from them during this period, which would, in the COVID-19, is accelerated.
No, Linda, that's in diplomacy. Every country, whether it's the European Union or the US or France or Germany, all of them have their interests that they want to promote in their relationship with a particular country or a region. It's just common. And so, to say that the Chinese want this or the Chinese want that, every country has this or that they want from their relationship with Africa. It's just as straightforward as that. Now, it must be said that Africa is, prior to COVID-19, faced many developmental challenges, and continues to face those. And as I said, prior to COVID, the relationship between China and Africa was a very healthy and a very strong one. Now, after COVID-19, and it has emerged from the recent video conference between Xi Jinping and President Ramaphosa, that, as I said earlier on, there's going to be increasing cooperation, strengthening the cooperation in that process. So that's going to happen. But I just must say that China is not only a country that Africa is working with. Africa has, I mean, what we are seeing in the world today is actually a new scramble for Africa. Russia recently had an Africa-China summit in Sochi. The South Koreans have that. The Indians have that. The EU is a strong interest in Africa. So Africa has a lot of partners. And I think what needs to happen in this relationship, and I'll come back to debt now, in this relationship is that they will have to be, Africa will have to emerge and say, these are the conditions under which we would like the Americans, the European Union, China, and all the others to engage and work with us in Africa. Africa will have to take, and the AU will have to take the lead in this by saying A, B, C, D. It's on African terms. These are the things we want from our relationship. And perhaps that has not happened sufficiently in the past. But I must say in this regard that China, being a developing country, has a very good understanding of the developmental challenges that Africa faced. China was dirt poor 30, 40, 50 years ago. So they understand much better than the former colonial powers, the British and the French, what the real challenges of Africa are. So it's in that context that I am optimistic, and I'm confident that the engagement between China and Africa, and I referred to the upcoming FOCAC conference in Senegal next year, where all these things will have to be put on the table. And I can just say my last point on debt. There is an issue about debt and debt risk on the African continent. China holds one third of all debt of African countries. But the interesting thing is, I attended the Belt and Road Initiative, we can talk about that later too, conference last year in Beijing, where China actually said that they realized, and Christian Lagarde from the IMF was there, there were many, Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN was there, where that China agreed and said, look, we realize that there are problems with debt management on the continent. And we are now launching a debt sustainability management initiative to work with African countries to see that they don't end up in a debt trap. And I foresee that this is something that will be discussed at the next FOCAC meeting in Senegal, and Africa will listen. China will listen to Africa and Africa's concerns, and it will be discussed around the table in consultation, in coordination, and I think there has been, and I've sensed that, not a reluctance, but there's been a greater awareness on the part of China to just simply lend money to Africa. And that's in the process of happening. And again, I say this will be discussed at the FOCAC meeting next year. So I can speak from a China and Africa point of view, is to say that it's going to be a cooperation based on mutual trust, on good faith, on a win-win situation. And people often refer to this win-win thing. It's an issue that is of great importance to China, that they don't want to be seen taking advantage of Africa. or of any country for that matter that they are working with. And that's my understanding of China's foreign policy after spending a year in that country.
Okay, can we start with questions from our community? There's one from Mary Jane Morris. She says, please comment on China's decimation of natural resources in Africa and its role in poaching. Why does the international community simply allow China to do what it wants? So if anybody would like to take that.
I just have a very simple answer to this, and that is that in many instances, what we have here is China's state-controlled companies doing what they want. I mean, this question goes to the question of corporate social responsibility of Chinese companies working in Africa, and of course, the reality is that Beijing has very little. So far has shown very little interest in assuring strict observance of good practices in this regard. But what we also don't need to, I mean, what's something we have to keep in mind is that in many instances, the local governments, or it's the African countries themselves that allow these things to go on and to happen. I mean, you could argue that they don't have a choice. But in reality, it's the weakness of the local legislation, the local norms sometimes allows these things to happen.
Do you think that's the case with South Africa, Ambassador Grobler?
Let me just make a general comment about that. You know, there is a lot of allegations in this regard, and I'm saying that given the extent of China investment and China's trade involvement in Africa, there are probably 10 to 11,000 Chinese companies on the continent right now. McKinsey brought out a report on that recently. But the fact is that I think this exploitation, whether it's wood, whether it's animals and so on, that is something that is not condoned by the government. These are individual companies, and it happens with South African companies involved in Africa. It happens with French companies in Africa. It happens all over. That does not mean that this situation should not be addressed. But the Chinese government, and I think the Professor Sergey alluded to that, I think the responsibility is increasingly on Africa, on the African Union, on individual countries in Africa to say to the Chinese, these are the conditions under which we want you to operate and work in our countries. If you don't adhere to that, we kick you out. In fact, it's happened in 1 or 2 countries recently, whether it's with labor relations or whether it's with the environment. The responsibility increasingly, and that's what I said early on, Africa's got to get its act together in its interaction with all its international partners, not only China. It happens all over. So I think from a South African point of view, we have South Africa has a huge footprint on the African continent. And I must say, by and large, that the interactions that have been taking place in the private sector and taking place in economic cooperation has been, by and large, constructive. And I don't see South African companies really partaking in exploitation and environmental devastation and so on. But China is a huge country. There's 1.4 billion people. There are, as I say, more than 10, 11,000 companies on the African continent. And surely you're going to have people that are embarking on unacceptable practices. And there's the other issue of that gets a lot of attention is the trade in wildlife, in bushmeat and so on. Now, China has, after, I can't go in all the detail, but China has, after COVID-19, taken a number of steps to stop that, to stop this. And I must also say that bushmeat and trade in in wild animals is not only China, it is the whole of Asia. It's in many countries. We export birds and we export wild animals to many countries in Europe. So it's not only China. I mean, China always is singled out as being this big transgressor. But what I said is that it is very encouraging that the government, after the outbreak of COVID, have introduced a number of really stringent steps to stop this. And I think if there's a country that can stop that, it's China, given the system in the country that it's well organized, it's a centralized based government, and that they will take the necessary steps.
Could I just add a small point? If
yeah,
I'm allowed
please.
to add a small point, I very much agree with what Ambassador Grobler is saying. We also have to remember that this is not a problem that is specific to Africa. And I'll give you one example. There's a growing concern about, for example, destruction of forests in Siberia as wood has been exported to China, and there have been allegations of Chinese companies essentially resorting to terrible methods, very environmental and friendly methods. But what enables this is local corruption, and the lack of institutional constraints that would somehow prevent this kind of exploitation from taking place. Now, if you compare that to situation, for example, in Europe, you have Chinese companies that are entering Europe at great speed, and sometimes even in crucial area like nuclear industry, etc. I mean, this is controversial in and of itself. As you know now, for example, in the UK, we have a big debate about whether or not to allow Chinese mobile phone technology or not in the UK. So, but at the same time, even as the Chinese companies are trying to enter Western European market, there's actually an institutional framework in place to limit any sort of damage. In other words, they have to play by the local rules. The tragedy is that many developing countries, and here I would put Russia and Africa on one plane really, do not have the kind of institutional constraints or framework that would dissuade or that would prevent these companies from exploitation or from environmental degradation. So that is a serious concern, and obviously it applies to Africa and many other countries as well.
Well, you mentioned markets, and of course, this was the Wuhan market where the coronavirus is said to have originated. And this question I actually expected. Somebody said, what do you make of speculation from the United States that the COVID-19 virus came out of a lab in Wuhan? And she wants to pose this question to Professor Radchenko.
Right. So the answer is okay, and this is going to be a slightly complicated answer. A lot of people are asking this question, and the reality is that nobody really knows the answer. Nobody really can tell. The problem is that that the Chinese government does not have credibility when it comes to these issues. That's the fundamental problem, I think. People don't believe what the Chinese government says. Why don't they believe that? Because of the history of cover-up in China. It has happened many times before. Just think about the SARS epidemic, for example. A cover-up took place there, and lessons were supposedly learned, but yet it turns out that nothing was learned at all. And we had instances that, obviously, in this case, we have documented effort to cover up early stages of this pandemic. So no matter whether the Chinese whether it was an accident or whether something more sinister was at play, the problem fundamentally is that the lack of transparency of the Chinese government allows this sort of conspiracy theories to proliferate, because people just don't believe what the government says. They don't believe what the government says. I mean, even the Chinese people themselves don't believe what the government says. Think about a few years ago. Well, it was now, I think at the time I lived in China, actually, it was more than a few years ago, but there were several scandals relating to things like, milk being tainted with some chemicals, stuff like that. And then as a result of that, there was, people would import or people would buy milk from New Zealand, because although the government said, well, we've taken measures, nobody actually believed that the Chinese government was taking measures or that the companies were not actually cheating the system. In other words, it's a fundamental problem of trust, which is very difficult to overcome, because you see, trust, it takes a very, very long time to build up trust, and it's very easy to basically lose trust. And because the Chinese government has over years repeatedly has either misled the public or released false information or doctored the numbers. I mean, that's a problem that goes back to the 1950s. They've consistently done that. There's just no trust in anything the Chinese government says. I mean, that's just my personal view, and that's what allows this conspiracy theories proliferate. But yeah, I think that's the answer.
Ambassador Grobler, what do you say about the conspiracy theories?
I say I differ somewhat from Professor. Is that I think it's, in principle, it has been agreed that the virus came from Wuhan, but where it came from, whether it came from animals, how it originated, there is no medical scientific proof to that. And what has happened now, and China has agreed to that there would be an independent investigation led by the WHO, which will investigate this matter and try and come to the bottom of this very complex issue. So until such time as the scientists have spoken on this, all the rest is speculation or conspiracy theories. On the issue of China's transparency and openness about the virus, it's true that with SARS, I think in 2003, they learned a lot, because at that time there was bureaucratic issues, there was a delay. But if you look at the sequence of developments since in Hubei province, where Wuhan is situated, on the 27th of December, they first discovered this virus. And there were 2 or 3 steps subsequent to that, which I'm not, for the sake of time, not going to elaborate on, but where they were verifying the impact of this virus and what exactly it was. But on the 3rd of January, from 27th to the 3rd of January, they formally, officially informed the WHO. It's on record. It's on record in all the documentation of the WHO. They provided the DNA, the genetic DNA of this virus, and immediately the WHO informed the rest of the world. So it's all documented. I'm not going to elaborate on that. So it is simply to say that I think that the allegations that China tried to hide, there was not necessary transparency, that is debatable. It's questionable, and I think that we must await the outcome of this independent, the high-level panel on what exactly happened before we speculate, before we make allegations and indulge in finger-pointing and China bashing.
Okay, we've got a question from Carolyn McKinsey. She says, why does China take their own workers into Africa rather than using and upskilling the local workforce? I've also heard of rumors that at mines, the Chinese companies often bring in their own workers. They don't even have hard hats and the safety procedures. Anybody?
Well, can I respond to that?
I mean, they just...
I can... Sorry, go ahead, Professor.
No, please, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well,
No,
what can you say? This is just the modus operandi of Chinese companies. That's how they do stuff. They are very integrated internally, and they rely on their own workforce. And I think they have recognized the problem when you bring all the workforce from China. And they actually in recent years, they have tried to mitigate that by also offering some positions to the local. So I think I don't think we can say that they just do that. I think there actually has been a recognition of the problem, and they are trying to address this. But that's a problem that, again, is not unique to China. Some, other even Western companies on occasion do that, and that is because they perceive a lack of local expertise, a lack of local talent for highly technical tasks. Now, with China, it goes a little bit deeper because they actually bring their own construction workers. But like I said, I think they're starting to recognize the problem and take measures against that.
Okay, do you want to say, Ambassador Grobler?
Say that in 2018, McKinsey, which by the way is an American company, did a poll amongst 1,000 Chinese companies in 10 African countries. It's on the record, you can Google it, it's McKinsey's report on Africa. And from that report of McKinsey in 2018, it appeared from the 1,000 companies they polled that 90% of all the local staff are African. And furthermore, it emerged during the poll that 90% of all the 1,000 Chinese companies they polled have adequate and actually very good training facilities, skilling facilities available for their workers. So this general perception, I agree with the professor that this is an issue that's changing from what it was, say, 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. And I must say, I come back to the point I made earlier. The responsibility is Africa's to say to the Chinese, in terms of workforce, in terms of procurement, we want a win-win situation. We want we want projects, and we want projects that are sustainable with work opportunities for our people that's going to benefit our communities. So there's an increasing responsibility on the African Union and African countries individually to lay down the terms. And that's in our relationship with China, Africa's relationship with China, that's increasingly going to be an issue. And I come back to the Senegal meeting of FOCAC next year, which, given under these changing circumstances of COVID-19, is going to be more pressing than ever before.
Okay, if we can come back just a little bit to what is China getting from giving debt to Africa. There's a question here that somebody sent me. Are the foreign powers, including China, taking advantage of the economic devastation caused by the coronavirus pandemic to seize control of East Africa's strategic ports? And there's controversy at the moment around in Kenya's Mombasa and Sudan's Port Sudan, and also an inland container depot in Nairobi, which because of debt might be given to the Chinese. Any of you two know about that?
Would not be the first time. Would not be the first time, right? The reason that people are so concerned about what will happen with debt, etc., is because they see before their eyes as the Sri Lanka example of which ended up effectively surrendering a port in order to pay for the debts, right? So this kind of example, when that first came to light, really alerted people to the possibility of very, very serious problems down the road. I don't know how much leverage the Chinese government would actually have in forcing their hand on this kind of issues. I think, again, it depends. I think you have to go from country to country and see whether the Chinese would actually be successful in in getting the local government or to or forcing them in some kind of a situation like similar to Sri Lanka's. I'm not sure they would be. One thing that this reminds me of from the history of the Cold War. There was, in the early 60s, there was a very active American engagement with African countries, and then the Russians came as well. Well, they started in the late 50s, really, but then in the 1960s, they really got into Africa and they started, giving out aid and sponsoring all kinds of projects. And there was a debate in the American government at that time what to do about this Russian penetration of Africa. And one thing that I remembered from that debate was actually quite interesting. One American official said, well, the Russians are really getting into Africa big time. However, our own experience with Africa would suggest that it is effectively very difficult to get them to do what we want, and in the end we got burned and the Russians will get burned the same sort of way. So I think that shows that perhaps today's concerns about China getting into Africa have to keep in mind those constraints, and the constraints are the local agency that Africa can actually push back if they feel they're particularly threatened on one issue or another. So I would not be overly alarmist about this.
Ambassador Grohle?
What that I said earlier on is that on this issue of debt, China is increasingly aware of the challenges and have concerns about the debt situation in Africa. I attended a BRI conference, Belt and Road conference, I said in Beijing last year, and in that conference, and it's been the subsequent approach of China, is that they said, we're aware of the dangers or the challenges for Africa, that we are now going to embark on a managed or initiative of debt, sustainable debt management, that we're going to work with the African countries, not only in the standards of projects, we're going to look at the financing, we're going to look at the environment. All these things came out of the BRI conference last year, and of course was built on subsequently and expanded subsequently by China. So again, these are issues that will be discussed in FOCAC next year in a spirit of mutual trust, in a spirit of good faith, and on the basis of win-win. I come back to the point that if there's a country that understands Africa's development challenges, it's China, from a dirt poor background. I've served in a number of countries, in the US, and Germany, and Britain, and Spain, and I've witnessed the interaction between those countries in Africa. And I can say to you, based on my experience, that there is no country that showed the same kind of compassion and concern for the serious development challenges that Africa experiences and wants to work with them, as I say, on a basis of mutual respect, mutual trust, and win-win. That is, I can just say that that's my experience in China after a year. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a comment here from Mary Grenfell. She says, fishing is another example of exploitation, but this is exactly what you two said. I think locals are as much to blame for not enforcing laws. If you look at what's happening in the world at the moment between China and the US, China at the moment, or Britain picking a fight with it over Hong Kong, are we heading for another Cold War? Professor Rodchenko is a Cold War expert, and Gert Grobler also knows about the Cold War era. Are we heading for another standoff between the superpowers, either about Africa or about resources in general? And that's the question I got from Muletsi Mbeki.
It is a very interesting question. Historians and political scientists disagree massively over whether what we're experiencing today in US-China relations represents a return to the Cold War. And the reason they disagree is that one thing is absent today that was present in during the Cold War, and that is this question of ideology and the fact that somehow well, during the Cold War, Beijing was promoting a particular revolutionary model that it no longer promotes, because effectively in the 1970s, it abandoned that model and embraced instead development instead of revolution as the way forward. So today, the question is, well, does the Chinese model, is the Chinese model something that is completely different from Western model of development, or is there a lot of overlap there? That's one part of the question. And then the other part of the question is, to what extent is China really the same kind of actor like the Soviet Union was? Because the Soviet Union was leading a system of alliances. The Soviet Union had allies in Eastern Europe, or satellites or clients. It was waging, it was aggressively targeting the developing world. It was sending military forces. It was invading some countries, etc. Of course, the Americans were doing much the same as well. Today, the competition seems to be focused, first of all, on the economic sphere much more than the military sphere, and secondly, the world is all very intertwined in the way that during the Cold War, just that interdependence wasn't there. And lastly, China doesn't seem to have a system of alliances that it can rely on to try to undermine the global order. So all of those considerations would suggest that today we have something different in place compared to the Cold War. I think that would be my answer to your question. On the other hand, there are also certain continuities, and one important continuity is that places like Africa, whole regions could then become as a contesting ground for superpowers. That certainly happened during the Cold War. Think about what happened in Angola, where you had a civil war where the Russians and the Cubans were fighting for one side. The South Africans were supporting somebody else. The Americans were supporting somebody else. The Chinese came in from another angle. And there was this gigantic, very difficult mix that prolonged the conflict and just caused so much more extra suffering, because the superpowers were not just supporting different sides, but also were providing them with finances, training, and weapons. Crucially, right? Weapons, extremely important. And so the fear is that Africa could become this kind of contesting ground, because look what happened after the Cold War. Yeah, Africa sort of lost importance for the superpowers and they withdrew from Africa. The Russians just basically abandoned Africa. They're trying to come back now, very much alarming the New York Times with their exploits in various places. On the other hand, there's also Chinese involvement, and so the Americans may eventually recognize this as a threat to them and would also try to get in there, and so Africa might again turn into a ground of contestation between great powers or superpowers, and I think that actually contains some danger for Africa going forward.
Okay, we've got sort of about 8 minutes left. Gert, your opinion about Africa becoming the next Cold War playing ground?
Well, Linda, I think there is a danger of that. There's a distinct danger of this. And the problem is that over the last 3 or 4 years, under the Trump administration, they have opted for a counterproductive, negative approach to China. There's been China bashing on a daily basis, particularly over the last few months, against China. And to a large extent, it was bad before COVID, but it escalated after COVID, because I think Trump and others in the West tried to conceal their own shortcomings in terms of dealing with COVID. But deeper than that, there is a fear, there is a concern on the part of the US and the West that the successes of China internationally, whether it's economically, I mean, China has been growing at 9% over the last 10 years, or at least up to about 2-3 years ago. There is a concern about the fact that China is this huge success. China has also made considerable progress up to 6 months ago with establishing international partnerships. I mean, for example, a week ago, they had their summit with the European Union. And the European Union and China agreed, although there are areas that they disagreed on, that they're going to work. They're going to cooperate together. They're going to expand their relationship. They're going to look at an investment agreement. It's a constructive approach. But the US has got this childish, counterproductive approach towards China. And so I'm seriously worried about the possibility, and in fact, this has also now gone further to the South China Sea, and where China's approach has always been one of a defensive one. But if you look at what the Americans are doing now in the East or in South China Sea, where the odds are overwhelmingly against China. I mean, the Americans have bases in South Korea, they have bases in Japan, they have bases in Okinawa, they have bases in Guam. The Chinese are actually outgunned in the Pacific Asia area. So they have obviously stepped up their activities. And of course, joined together with that is that over the last, given all these attacks against China by Fox News and by Trump and by Pompeo, China had to speak up and say, I mean, there was a lot of, people saying, well, China's gone overboard. They had to protect their core interests in whatever field it was, economic or it was South China Sea. But I can only hope that there is going to be a change of government in the US, which will hopefully bring back things to normality between the US and its partners all over the world. I mean, they've broken the transatlantic partnership. They fight economically with India, with the EU, with Canada. They have fights with everyone. And I think till sanity prevails and that the world says, let's sit down, and that's what China has said consistently, let's sit down and find a solution, a mutually beneficial solution for the world towards stability, towards development, to economic growth. And I can tell you, China would be ready tomorrow to move to such a table, like they did now with the European Union, to have a sensible discussion based on respect and good faith between China and its international partners, including the United States. But I'm worried about the present situation, and hopefully there will be, although the Democrats are also now using China in this electoral process, which is sad. China has become a political play ball or a pawn in this electoral process. But hopefully good sense will prevail, hopefully if there's a new government in the US.
Well, that was a nice summary of what you were both saying. It seems you were saying, if I can summarize, that Africa needs to push back if that comes from China, and Africa needs to say what the rules are going to be for Chinese engagement, if I'm correct. Thank you so much, Ambassador Gert Glover and Professor Sergei Rodchenko, for participating. And we are also going to put this on YouTube, and which means it's got longer legs and people can see what you have to say. Thank you so much for participating, both of you.